Welcome to episode 26 of the Mysteries of the Mass podcast. In this episode, part 1 of 2, we have Monsignor Gerard O'Connor, the Director of the Office of Divine Worship for the Archdiocese of Portland, offering a workshop on what is called the Archdiocesan Liturgical Handbook. The handbook contains the norms and the best practices desired by the Archdiocese of Portland in all aspects of the liturgy and the sacraments. This is a workshop that occurred at St. Anne Catholic Church in Grants Pass, Oregon on March 23, 2019. Let's listen in.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. So I think you can probably all see this, with the light, and I'm going to be explaining things. So it's just an aide-memoire for me, really, to get through all the points I'd like to get through. But we'll... I think that will work. Anyway, so my name is Monsignor Gerard O'Connor. I'm the Director of the Office of Divine Worship for the Archdiocese of Portland in Oregon. I'm a priest of the Diocese of Fall River, which is in Massachusetts, which is just below Boston. It's a diocese. There are 4 dioceses in Massachusetts, and Fall River's the one that covers the south of Boston. It also covers Martha's Vineyard, Nantucket Island, and Cape Cod, which is a nice part of our diocese. But then we have New Bedford, which is as one of the highest murder rates in the country. So we have a bit of everything in our diocese. We have some extreme poverty and extreme crime. New Bedford is a port town where the statistics are that the majority of heroin and cocaine come in through New Bedford and around there. So there's a massive problem with drugs. So we have real inner city problems. But then we have Nantucket, which is one of the wealthiest places in the world with some beautiful things. So we have a bit of everything in our diocese. I'm originally from England, hence the outrageous accent. I was born in Yorkshire, in Hull, in 1964. I don't know why I said that in 1964, but like Sean Connery, I was born in Edinburgh in 1982. And then I wasn't a priest when I came to America. I was working in the computer industry, and I worked for an American company based out of London. I was in the London office, and they asked me to come to headquarters in Boston in 1992. And then after I'd lived in Massachusetts for 2 years, I wanted to be a priest. That's what happens in Massachusetts. It just makes you want to do something radical, get out. So I became a priest of the Diocese of Fall River. My then bishop was Bishop Sean O'Malley, now Cardinal Sean O'Malley of Boston. So that's my history. Well, a little bit more. I was ordained in 2000. I then was, strangely enough, sent back to Rome to work for the Vatican. And I was trained in Rome, and then I went to work for the Holy See. I worked in the office of clergy, the Congregation for Clergy, which deals with all the issues of clerical life. Mainly disputes between bishops and priests, that sort of stuff. Our job was really there to defend the priests. The Congregation of Bishops was there to defend the bishops. Our job was to help our poor priests when they're fighting with their bishops and things like this. It was a canonical office. But we also looked after patrimony of the Holy See, which is all the goods of the Holy See, and catechesis as well. And we also dealt with various other things. So I did that for 7 years. I worked in the canonical office in Rome, and then I came back and I've been a pastor for the last 10 years in Acushnet in Massachusetts, a pastor with a Catholic school. And then a year and a half ago, my bishop called me in and said, hey, do you know this guy called Sample? And I said, no, I've heard of him. And he said, well, he wrote me a very compelling letter, and he said that he wants you to come and work for him. I have a doctorate from San Anselmo, which is quite rare in sacred liturgy, so I'm one of the few people in America that have that. And so he said, Sample's made a very good case that you should go and work for him, because I'm not using you in this area, so do you want to go? And I said, well, sure, if you want me to go, I'll go. So he said, good, go. And that was... And that was the last time I spoke to him so far, anyway. So, no, I'm on loan for 3 years. He asked Archbishop Sample asked for 5 years. Usually these jobs go in a quinquennium, as they're called, 5 years. But the bishop said, I'll give you for 3, and then we'll review it. And if you don't like it, he doesn't like you, I don't like him, we can all stop it after 3 years. If you want to stay for the 5, and we all agree you can stay for 5. So that's why I'm here. So I'm here... because of my qualification, I suppose. The Archbishop wanted me because of my expertise in sacred liturgy. Now, so I'm going to give a talk today about liturgy, sort of in general, specifically about the Archdiocesan Liturgical Handbook, because I want to mitigate some misconceptions about that, and really the talk is just general about liturgy and what liturgy is, and what we do. And so what I would like to think is after this, you will all go away with some real zeal for the liturgy, understanding that when we celebrate liturgy, we're worshiping God. That's basically, what liturgy is. It's not about us, and we'll see as I give you some quotes today. Every liturgist in the world has got his own definition of what liturgy is. All right, so everybody's got some good stuff. And I've just scattered through this presentation just some slides that I put together for some quotes I was giving in a presentation somewhere at a conference. And so you'll see some of these great liturgists. Some names you'll be familiar with, some not. But these are the great liturgists, I'd say, of the 20th century, and some of their quotes. So we'll see some of those. So how did this all start off? Well, I was asked to come here by my bishop and Archbishop Sample, and I'd never met the man. And I remember that first day I walked into the pastoral centre. He was actually walking down a corridor, and I was walking down the other corridor. And I recognised him because he was wearing black, of course. He had a cross on as well. So, but anyway, so I met the man, and I've got to say, Archbishop Sample is a super guy to work with. He's got a great personality. He's actually got a tremendous sense of humour. I travel with him all the time. We're long journeys in cars and things like this, and we're never short of something to talk about, and usually it ends up with some sort of humour in it as well. He's really got a great sense of humour. But anyway, so that's the first time I met him. So we went and sat down, and we said, what are we going to do here? What's my brief? How do I, what's it like? So he gave me a view of the Archdiocese, and he said, look, this is what we want. Our goal should be to achieve a more beautiful, more reverent, more prayerful experience of divine worship in the diocese for the faithful of the Archdiocese. And that's basically it. So off you go, get that done, and come back and see me in 3 years. And I haven't spoken to him since. No. So that was a sort of broad vision of what he wants to achieve. So the Archdiocesan Liturgical Handbook came out of that vision of how do we go about doing this? Well, there is a way that the Church wants liturgy to be executed, right? It is not just a sort of random thing of saying, oh, go and celebrate Mass, Father. No, it's totally regulated by the Holy See. Not even by the local diocesan bishop. He doesn't have much say in how Mass is executed or Mass is celebrated. The Holy See, the Vatican. And this is one of the problems. The minute I mention the Vatican, people go, we're not those sort of Catholics. We're Oregon Catholics. We do our own thing. We're Portland Catholics. We don't do what the Pope says, what the Vatican says. That's, Well, I'm sorry, the minute you've said that, you're not Catholic anymore. Because the whole thing about being Catholic is that we're universal and that we come under the rule, the bark of St. Peter, that we believe that this Pope and all the popes before him were successors of St. Peter. So we put our salvation in his hands. We go towards eternity being sons and daughters of Holy Mother Church, of whom the Pope is Peter. So that's who we are as Catholics. If we don't believe that, if we don't like that, then we're not Catholics anymore, and we might as well turn the lights out and go somewhere else, because there's better things to do than this. Well, when I say there's better things, nothing better to do than this Catholic thing. But there are more entertaining things to do. And there are things which are much easier to do, that's for sure, right? Every religion's got something a little bit easier and much more easier than what we have to put up with our striving to be holy, with that universal call to holiness that we have. I mean, it's tough, right? So go somewhere else where we're not interested in being holy. We're just interested in helping each other. No, it's not Catholic, and we're Catholics. So, how did this come about? The Archdiocesan Liturgical Handbook was a case of making everybody aware of how the Church expects liturgy to be celebrated. So we have massive amounts of information that have been coming to us from the beginning of the 6th century about how Mass is celebrated. All right? So some of our ways of doing things are very ancient, some of them are very new. The Church is constantly changing liturgically. It's developing all the time. We are not stuck in one era. We're not stuck in 1958. And on the other hand, we are not stuck in 1973, which some people would like to keep us there, right? Because things have changed. And I'm going to go through the Vatican document, Sacrosanctum Concilium, and tell you what happened after the council. Because there is this mentality. and I will say this in a very nice way, of people of a certain age, that Sacrosanctum Concilium is the be-all and end-all of liturgy. And they will take two words out of that and take it out of context. And Sacrosanctum Concilium was the blueprint of liturgical reform in 1963. And it's taken 50 years of other documents from the Vatican, other clarifications, other motu proprio, other encyclicals from the Church to actually get us to where we are in 2019. And that's what the Archdiocesan Liturgical Handbook is a compilation of all that stuff since 1963 in one place. So we can all look at it and see, oh, okay, that's why we do that now, because of something Pope Benedict promulgated in 2015. You know, so that's really the Archdiocesan Liturgical Handbook. It was there so that we could all sing off the same worship aid, basically, have everybody know where everything is. And the other thing I would say about the ALH is people, you know, I get a lot of criticism about it because people don't read it, of course. So they criticize things like, oh, I'm not allowed to process in with the priest anymore. That's just offensive to me. I find that awful, and I think the Archdiocesan Liturgical Handbook is taking us back to 1953. Well, actually, you've not read the ALH. You've just said you've found something that you don't like, therefore you hate the whole thing. That's not logical, and it's not grown up either, is it? Because the first 5 chapters of the ALH are about Holy Mass and the Eucharist. The other 15 chapters are about everything else that we do in the church. Like, for instance, do you want to know if you can move your patronal feast to a weekday and keep it as a solemnity? Well, you might not be interested in that, but Father Bill's interested in that, because when the Feast of St. Anne comes up on a Sunday during Lent, he can't celebrate it. But he needs to know when he can move it. Where do you find that information? It's in the ALH. Is it an evil book? Because it tells you that you shouldn't walk in with the priest, because it has all this great information elsewhere. No, because people focus on one thing they don't like, and they think the whole thing's a waste of time. It's got some tremendous things in there. Anyway, so how did it start off? Archbishop Sample says we want more reverent, more prayerful, more beautiful experience of liturgy. So, how do we do this? Well, one thing would be, what about putting this thing together with all, the norms of liturgy, the regulations of liturgy? Well, great. So we started doing this, and we're going to call it the Archdiocesan Norms. And then when we're getting some feedback from the Presbyteral Council and for the deans, they said to us, well, you know what? It sounds like Archdiocesan Norms as though this is a book of norms for the Archdiocese, which are unique to the Archdiocese, that are separate, that are new rules, that Archbishop Sample is, imposing these rules on the Archdiocese. And we said, you're right there, and it may give people, the heebie-jeebies when they think this whole book of new rules coming. And there wasn't. So that's when we changed the title to the Archdiocesan Liturgical Handbook, to get the point across that this is nothing new in here. This is what the Church teaches right now, 2018, about how Mass is to be celebrated, how the sacraments are to be celebrated, who can be sponsors at and godparents at baptism, all these things that people ask every day of my office. So part of it was a selfish thing. If we put it all together, people stop calling me, right? And then I can get back to a parish, so I don't have to do these things. But literally, that's a reason it's there. So, when people call me now and say, "Oh yeah, what should we say? Can we do this communion service in a nursing home or a prison or whatever, something like this?" I respond to them and I say, "Yes, if you check with the ALH section 4.2.9, there it is. There's all the regulations for that sort of stuff. So I don't have to, go into a lot of things anymore because it's in there. Thanks be to God." Anyway, let me get back. So I started. Archbishop Sample sets a vision. I then, as any good researcher, goes and looks around what other dioceses are doing in the country, right? So that we can steal it, so we don't have to redo our own thing, which is, common practice nowadays. Not steal it, you'd ask for it. So I didn't. So I looked around, and it's funny because some of the large dioceses like Denver, Washington, Philadelphia's got a great office of worship department. Boston. But still, there was nothing quite like what we're looking for. There are other dioceses that have nothing. You can go on their website, you find nothing about liturgy. And I know in my own diocese, we just don't have any liturgy department. So there's nothing. We don't produce anything. It's the same old stuff. And it just goes to show, some bishops are interested in liturgy, some bishops are not, right? And if Mass is the source and summit of our whole Christian life, then every bishop in the world should be thinking about liturgy first, everything else second. But unfortunately, it's not like that. So we looked around the diocese. We saw some good things. So I have a friend who's the director of worship in Washington, Father Mark Nestout, who is sort of famous in our world because when the Pope came to Washington, Father Mark Nestout was in charge of all those arrangements for the masses in Washington, things like this. So Snouty, as he was called in the seminary. So I called Snouty and I said, hey, Snatty, can I borrow some of the stuff you've done? He said, oh, sure, of course. And then I had a friend who's a professor in Denver in the seminary. They've got some good stuff. She's a doctorate in liturgy. She did a doctorate with me at the Anselmo in Rome. So I called her and said, can we use some of your stuff? Gladly, So I called, so we had this whole sort of thing. And it was all different. And what we said was, we need a bit more theology behind this, because some of them are just, here's the rubrics, and there's no theology. So we desired that we would write this book with all the instructions of how to celebrate various liturgies, but we wanted some theology behind it. So the theology of this principle of lex credendi lex orandi. The law of belief is the law of prayer. So what we believe is expressed in what we pray. So we can have a book that says, okay, well, you genuflect here at this point. Well, these postures are important. What does it mean to genuflect? Well, when we genuflect, we're acknowledging what we believe in the Eucharist, right? So these sort of things. So it wasn't just a case of, and now the priest stands. That's a bit of a simple thing. But now the priest does this. Why? There's a bit more of this. So, desire more theology. One thing I often, when I'm doing stuff, is that I like to see the academic sources and references. So, if you see how the way this is written, it's done to the level of a doctoral thesis where the sources are, as far as possible, the original sources of the documents. So, they're referred to in a standard academic way, Roman way, of the sources. And what it is in there is that the footnotes are extensive. So when the Archdiocesan Liturgical Handbook writes a paragraph, it will have two references in there. It will reference to the documents that the sources are from. So it's not like we're making it up. We're wording it, that's for sure. It was worded by us, me and my consultors. But there's really nothing new in it. I mean, we're just taking stuff that the Vatican has issued and we're saying, okay, we'll explain it for you without having to read all the documents. But here are the documents if you want to go back and look at it, the original sources, right back to Sacrosanctum Concilium. There are very few references that go back before Vatican II, very few. There is an emphasis on the Holy Eucharist, of course. The first 5 chapters of 20 chapters are about the Holy Eucharist, celebration of Mass. And then, of course, this idea of ars celebrandi, which is Latin, which just means the art of celebrating, the art of celebrating. We wanted to get that across for those who celebrate the sacraments, the priests, the deacons, and those who are involved in the celebration of the sacraments, those who prepare for parish celebration. So, in summary, it's a theological treatment of the sacred liturgy. It's a treatise on the celebration of Most Holy Eucharist, of course. It's a description of the various rites of the Church. And realize, this is not just about Mass. It covers RCIA. It covers all the sacraments. It covers marriage and funerals. It covers sacramentals, all sorts of things in there that it is a place to refer to universal norms and local norms. And what I mean by universal norms are those which are given to us by the Holy See or the Vatican, by the popes and their teachings. They're universal norms. No one can change those universal norms, right? A bishop cannot legislate against a universal norm. He has some choices which are called local norms, and they are conceded to him by the Holy See. This is sort of canonical area, but basically it's me saying, okay, this is in general what you must do throughout the world. If you apply to me as the United States, and I give you permission, I'll allow you to do that in the United States. Or individual bishops can apply to me to do certain things. This is the Holy Father through his officers, right? So they're what's called local norms. So the United States, and this is very rare as well. I mean, basically, some things were done in the 70s and 80s, but basically bishops are not applying for any degradations from the universal law right now, I don't think. No, so basically universal. So we'll get into a couple of those, what the difference between universal norms and local norms. But bear this in mind. If it's a universal norm of the Roman Catholic Church, no bishop can legislate against that. So, for instance, communion in the hand. is an indult that was given to the United States in 1972, I think. And every country in the world, apart from 3, allows communion in the hand. The universal norm for communion is receiving on the tongue. The indult has been given to every country that they can do that. That is an indult approved by the Holy See for that country. No bishop can legislate against that because it's a universal norm. So, if Archbishop Sample doesn't like communion in the hand, it's fair enough, but it's a universal norm of the Catholic Church in America. He can't legislate against that. So he couldn't ban that in his diocese. So that's the sort of thing. For instance, a universal norm is that glasses, wine glasses cannot be used for holy distribution of precious blood, right? That's a universal norm. So no one can legislate against that. So the Archbishop Sample couldn't come out tomorrow and says, right, I want everybody to start using wine glasses next week. He couldn't do that. He's going against something. So that's just silly examples, but that's the principle. If a universal norm is set by the Church, by the supreme legislator, which is the Pope, then we can't go against that. Whether we like it or not, that's the other thing. Let's face it, this is not about my preferences or Archbishop Sample's preferences. This is about what the Church wants us to do right now. And that's another thing people think, that the minute you say something like this, it's all about preference. It's not. There are 6 preferences in this whole book, which I go through at the end of the presentation, I'll tell you. And they're so sort of bizarre. Not bizarre, but they're so, uneventual, it doesn't really matter. At the end of the day, the ALH is this vision for liturgical excellence. What's the audience of the Archdiocesan Liturgical Handbook? Priests and deacons, pastoral associates, seminarians, students of liturgy, liturgy coordinators, and anyone who's interested in the sacred liturgy. That means everybody, basically. Everybody who comes to Mass at the weekend should be interested in the sacred liturgy. They shouldn't sit there like they're bored or they just don't care or they just want to get out. They should be interested in the liturgy, should be interested in the music. They should get involved, they should sing, they should be attentive to the readings, The reason why we get up there and read the readings is that so people can listen to them and absorb them and think about them and cogitate on them and ruminate on them. And, that's great participation at Mass. But what do? We rarely do that, don't we? We're just like, can't wait for this to be over, or can't wait for that homily to be over. No offense, Father Bill, no offense. But this is so, everybody who's interested in liturgy should be, this is the most important thing we do, and everything else flows from the altar. Everything we do out in the world comes from this altar. Technically, it was written to be a PDF, electronic document, of course. Now, we obviously print them now, but the reason why it was a PDF is because it's searchable, because it's a big document, it's 400 pages. So if you're looking for sponsors for sponsors for baptism, where do you go? Well, you can go on the index and look in section 3 under baptism, and then you can go down the index and look for Or you can go Control F, sponsors, and it will take you to the book where it's mentioned, in 3 parts, for godparents, of confirmation, godparents, etc. So it was meant to be a PDF. It was meant to be searchable. Then we sort of signed up with Amazon. We got the deal, the Kindle, because the Kindle was important because Kindle's a little bit more complicated than the PDF. You can actually highlight things. You can set references and notes and things like this in it as well. So Kindle's quite handy, and a lot of people wanted to use it like that. And then they print it as well. This is on-demand printing by Amazon. So these books, the black and white version is $25 on Kindle. There's a color version it's only got 5 color plates in it, but the numbering is color. So it means that every page is a color page. And so that's why that book's $50. But I don't think we've sold 4 of them or something. It's really not worth. It's beautiful. The pages, the plates that we put in there are very nice. But obviously we didn't think anybody would buy that, so we made it a black and white version. But it's a print on demand, and we've got some copies with us, and we get author copies for $15, and we pass them on to you if you want to buy those. We send original copies to every priest in the archdiocese, every parish, but it was devised as an electronic document because it will be easily updated. Now, we've got nothing really big coming out from the Congregation of Divine Worship in Rome of new rites or new translations yet. The next big thing will be 2020, when we probably get a new breviary, and we'll update our documents then. But really all the new stuff was in there when we came to the end. You know, the new order of marriage, the new order of confirmation, things like this were already in there. So it's really smack up to date. 385 pages, 140,000 words, 20 chapters, 2,000 footnotes, which, again, as a sort of, you know, semi-scholar, it's really important because, you know, I was listening to a history podcast the other day, and the professor giving this podcast, it was about ancient Britain, about Anglo-Romano Britain, and he was talking about, you know, history and all this, and he said, if you don't read the footnotes, then you better just stop reading, right? Because you're just going to get the little précis, the little, you know, cliff notes of history, but you've got to go back and read the footnotes. You've got to do that, you know, if you're going to be serious. So I'm pleased about the way this was written. The footnotes are there if you want to read them, right? If you have a discussion, if you say, oh, I don't agree with that, I don't think the church should do this, or I don't agree with what was said here, well, go back and see who said it. And then you say, oh, it was Paul VI. I love Paul VI. Oh, yeah, I do agree with it now. But, you know, you're thinking, oh, I bet Benedict said that. Oh, he's a miserable German, and he made all these rules, and he made the buses run on time, and we don't like him. Well, go back a little bit further, and you'll find out it was actually Paul VI who did it, and not Benedict, and then you'll feel better about it, right? But that's why the footnotes are in there, so you know who said what and why. And then we're going to go, and there's a 114 cited text, which, again, and what we did in the PDF version, which is quite cute, Father Bill will be happy about this, we hyperlinked it. So, and you go to the PDF version, those that have got the reference, those that have got documents on the internet, mainly the Vatican. So if you want to look at Sacrosanctum Concilium, it's not hyperlinked to the exact text, it's just hyperlinked to the document. We couldn't work that one out. So you click on the text, it will take you to the original document. And that's done for all of the 114 cited texts that exist on the internet. So that's a handy tool. If you're studying, this is why we want it, you know, for seminarians. If you're studying liturgy, it's a handy thing. You just click on that, it will take you to the original document, and you can read before and after the bit we were quoting. Definition of liturgy. Everybody's got a different definition, and we'll look at some of these. The one definition that is false is this idea that it's the work of the people. It's not the work of the people. It's the participation of the people in the work of God. The liturgy is the work of God. And we had this liturgo, I think liturgo in Greek. It was a public work, it was a public service. It was something you did for the community. And that was taken out of context by many people, sort of like said, liturgy is the work of the people. It's all about the people. No, that's only half true. It's the work of the people. It's the participation of the people in the work of God. And and then we can go on. But the Catechism has got the best definition there. In Christian tradition, it means the participation of the people of God in the work of God. Through the liturgy, Christ, our Redeemer and High Priest, continues the work of our redemption in, with, and through His Church. It's a nice definition. If you ever, if you ever put in a corner on a bus and says, "What's liturgy?" then quote this one rather than making something up. I'll make something up, but here's a great. The Benedictines were the liturgists of the, of 19th, 20th century. And Ilfons Herwegen was the abbot of Maria Lacht in Germany, who was one of the great centers of liturgical study and development of the 19th century. Here's his definition. The Church's liturgy is the breath of the praying Christ, the glorified high priest. That's a beautiful definition. It's the breath of the praying Christ, Christ praying to the Father. Imagine him in Gethsemane there, this idea that Christ praying to the Father, which brings in a whole different sort of theological question is, why does Christ have to pray, Here's Guido Marini. Guido Marini is the current maestro of the papal house, is the, what do they call it? The Office of the Celebration of Papal Liturgies. He's the guy you always see stood on the left of the Pope during the papal liturgies. He's in charge of putting all this together. He's a great liturgist, although trained as a canon lawyer, but ended up being a liturgist. Here's his definition. Liturgy is God's summons to his people to be in his presence. It is the beginning, if you like, the advent of God among us. It's the summons of God for his people to come into his presence. It's a nice definition. Anyway, so we're going to talk a little bit about the Second Vatican Council now, but let's go back to the Council of Trent. And people say to me, let's not get stuck in the 70s. And I say, no, we shouldn't get stuck in the 70s. You mean the 1570s? Yes, let's talk about the 1570s. The Council of Trent, there were 4 important issues going into the Council of Trent. Remember, the Council of Trent was the response to the Protestant Reformation. These were the issues going in there: celibacy, veneration of images, communion under both species, and vernacular in the liturgy. Let me take Council of Trent out there. Cross out Trent and... Oh, that's wrong one. Cross out Trent and put in Vatican II. So the Council of Vatican II, 4 of the big issues going into the council were, guess what? Celibacy, veneration of images, communion of both species, and vernacular in the liturgy. Some of you remember in the 70s we lost a whole slew of priests, right? Because the big talk was in 1964, 1965, 6, 7, was that priests were going to relax the discipline about celibacy, priests were going to be able to get married. And so people started doing some strange things, and then when they were told they couldn't get married, they had to make some decisions. And we lost a lot of priests at that time because the laws on celibacy were not going to change. And various other laws about Catholic sexual morality were not going to change. So there was a lot of priests that left. But celibacy was an issue going into Vatican II. A lot of the church fathers were talking about whether we should relax that discipline. Second one, veneration of the images. Some of you remember after the Second Vatican Council, when you came to your church 6 weeks later, all the statues had been removed. The altar rail had been knocked down and the altar had been turned around. Things like this had happened. It was quite traumatic for a lot of you. I remember people telling me. But the same thing happened after Trent, you know. There was this Protestant, the Reformation, said we don't want, you know, the Protestants always say some silly things like, oh, you Catholics, you worship Mary. You've got all the statues all the time. You're always kissing statues and things. We don't allow that. That's idolatry. You Catholics, strange people. And you are, let's face it. So the Protestant Reformation said, get rid of all this. So if you see what happened in England in the 16th century under Elizabeth I, these beautiful cathedrals were wrecked. They started pulling out altars because they don't want altar because that means sacrifice. They put little tables in front of their high altars. They knocked down statues and they just ruined some of the churches. Even all over the world, I mean, other places where Protestant, in Geneva, and going in Catholic churches, taking them over, painting over frescoes and all this sort of stuff, because the Protestants said, you Catholics, you're worshipping images, and you can't do that. It's against the 10 Commandments. It's real clear. And then the second thing was communion of both species, which is a big issue at the Council of Trent. So it was a big discussion on the table. Why were they discussing communion of both species? Well, the Protestants said, we've got to have communion of both species, because that's what happened at the Last Supper, and that's what we're doing here. This is the Last Supper, right? No. This is Calvary, not the Last Supper. There's a bit of Last Supper in there, but you're missing the Calvary part, the sacrifice of Christ on the cross to the Father for the reparation of sins, and him becoming, in the form of bread and wine, on our altars, the Eucharist. Well, we don't believe that anymore as Protestants. That's popish witchcraft, hocus pocus, right? So there is no sacrifice. There is no Jesus Christ in the bread and wine. It's bread and wine. And we will have bread and wine, not just bread. So what happened? Trent could have said, okay, yeah, well, you've got half of that right, which is the bread and wine, yeah. But our people don't need to receive the bread and wine. And in fact, we're going to ban it because of your attitude, because communion of both species is a clarion call of the Protestants. And therefore, Trent went down hard on this and said, no, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of our Lord Jesus Christ is present under both species, fully God, fully Jesus Christ. Therefore, the faithful in our continuous tradition do not need to receive from the chalice as well. So that was the big issue, because it was a case of, what do we do about this? The rest of the Protestants now throughout the world are receiving bread and wine, and I say bread and wine, not the Eucharist, are receiving bread and wine. Should we do the same? Council of Trent said, no, we're not going to copy the Protestants because our theology is much deeper. And why they're doing it with bread and wine is because they're actually saying something with their posture and their gestures, which is denying the presence of Jesus Christ in the Eucharist. So that was communion of both species. Vernacular liturgy. really, probably the biggest thing at the Council of Trent was the vernacular liturgy. We'd moved from a Latin church. No one spoke Latin throughout the world now. Some of our European languages are very close. Italian is obviously very close to Latin, and you can teach Latin to Italian school, second graders, they can get it. And in fact, people who are sort of uneducated in Latin, Italians, you give them a piece of Latin, they can sort of read it. But in the 15th century, the 16th century, apart from the Italians, a lot of people obviously were not even educated, so they couldn't read. But, the vernacular was the big issue. Why can't we just celebrate Mass in the language of the people? Well, what happened was the Protestants were doing this as well. So you see this is all a lot of reaction to what the Protestants were doing, which doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing or a bad thing. But the church was real strict, came down strict again and said, no, we will use the sacred language that we've been using for centuries, and we will not allow the vernacular into the sacred liturgy. So this is at the Council of Trent, so let's say 1560. So that's just a little bit of history. There were the four big issues going into Trent, right? Which lasted obviously over 20 years to get this sort of resolved. But these were the responses. We won't do these things because the Protestants are doing them, and they're doing them for all the wrong reasons. They're receiving communion of both species, bread and wine, because they don't believe in the Eucharist anymore. They deny the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. And if we allow our people to do that, we're sort of imitating the Protestants, and their gestures and postures and signs are very important. So that's why they wouldn't do that. Vernacular liturgy, similar sort of thing, because the Protestants now opened up the vernacular into the Bible and everything was done in the common language. Anyway, here's a liturgical principle. The church did not begin in 1964, nor did the rich patrimony of its liturgy. Oh, look, I quoted. That's me. I say that because, we've got to understand where we came from. It's sort of like me knowing that I'm, all Irish blood. Where do I come from? But my great-grandparents came over, in the famine probably, and they stayed, and then we intermarried in a Catholic Irish ghetto in Hull. And, I know more or less where I came from, I'm not proud of it. No, I am. But to start saying, like the church started its liturgy in 1970, say. That's when the new missal was published, in 1970, the Paul VI missal. You've got to know where that came from. You can't just say that, because we've been doing some of this stuff for centuries and centuries and centuries. I can talk about the Roman canon of the Mass, Eucharistic Prayer number 1. That was more or less codified in the 6th century by Gregory the Great, the beginning of the 7th century, 605. But scholars tell us that was more or less the format it was at the end of the 4th century. And that prayer's come through to us now with very minor changes, even in the new missal of Paul VI. So when we say the Eucharistic Prayer number 1, whether in Latin or English, we've been doing that with our fellow brothers and sisters since the end of the 4th century, and probably earlier than that. So, we can't just sort of like say that, this all started in 1970. It didn't. And it's foolish for us to think like that, because we're Catholics, because we live in eternity to a certain extent, or we should do. Our mind should be on the supernatural and the eternal things. With God, there is no time. It's all right now and present. So whether we go back and say, I didn't like that, it doesn't matter whether you like it or not. It saves souls. And people who sort of like say, I don't like anything of the old Mass. Well, that's fine, whatever. But rest assured, my friends, and I tell this to people of a certain age as well, how many children have you got? I'd say 4. How many go to church? Well, none of them, okay? My parents had 4 children, 4 boys, 2 heathens, one who's my eldest brother goes to daily Mass every day now, he's got 6 kids, and one who's a priest. So we're 50%, right, in that generation. What about before that? Well, before that, my father came from a family of 11. My mother came from a family of 9. Everybody went to church all their lives. They never dream of not going to church. They're all buried in the church. And their kids were about 50%. Nowadays, we're down to 0, right? So look at the statistics. I'm not just saying it's just the liturgy, but don't mock the old Mass, because it brought me to the priesthood through the faith of my parents. They had the faith that they gave me. I didn't grow up with the old Mass. I grew up I was born in 64. But it did it for generations who kept the faith going by, 50% and, whatever. And now we're down to, I talk to people and they say, oh, I hate the old Mass, anything Latin. How many kids have you got? 4. How many go to church? None. I'm not saying it's the old Mass, but I'm saying it's part of this whole thing. If you mock something that our parents brought their faith to us from, then we don't understand it. We don't understand it if that's the case. How can you say that Padre Pio, Padre Pio was so old and the Mass was changed, he was allowed not to celebrate the new Mass. So was Jose Maria Escrivá, because Paul VI put a provision in there and said, look, it's such a massive change, this thing. If you're of a certain age and you can't do it, you carry on saying the old Mass. Well, Escrivá was allowed to do it and various others. So, it's just dangerous to sort of think everything's 64 onwards. It's not. It's, our church is Catholic, it's universal, it's traditional, it's magisterial, it's old, and it's got some stuff worthy of us. So the Second Vatican Council, again, liturgical reform of the Second Vatican Council, well, again, it didn't start in 1964. It started really in the mid-19th century with Dom Guéranger, who was the Benedictine at Salem, who really wrote and rekindled interest in liturgical studies, and promoted the Benedictine way of things throughout the world. So in Salem and in Italy and in Germany and Maria Lact and all these places. So he really, some of us liturgists would call him the father of liturgical reform, father of liturgical movement. But then we see Pope St. Pius X at the beginning of the 20th century, who issues this great encyclical on sacred music, which sort of changes the whole sort of way we look at music. And then Pius XII, the Holy Week reform, the reform of the breviary and the Psalter, the Psalms, and this great encyclical Mediator Dei in 1947. So you can see things have been significantly changing up until that point. John the 23rd, of course, reformed the calendar in 1960 and issued the last Roman Missal or Tridentine Missal in 1962. Very few minor changes. He added the name of St. Joseph to the Roman canon. But the calendar was really changed. He was trying to simplify that calendar. It's funny, some priest just asked me a question the other day. We were on a conference call with the junior clergy, and the question was, when did the washing of the feet come into Mass at Holy Thursday? And I guessed the answer because I didn't know it. But I did go and research it, and I was actually right. So it was a good guess, I suppose. Some of my education paid off. It was Pius XII in the reform of Holy Week. So Holy Week before Pius XII was, they were celebrating masses. They were celebrating the Vigil Mass on Saturday morning, things like this. So, Pius XII comes in and says, well, let's get back to what this should be. The Vigil Mass should not be on Saturday morning like a normal, Mass at 8 o'clock. It should be in the Vigil because it is the Vigil of the solemnity of solemnities. And this is, so he reformed the whole of Holy Week. On Holy Thursday, the mandatum was done in religious houses throughout the world. It was called the mandatum because that was the word of the antiphon that they would sing at Vespers when the superior would wash the feet of certain men and women. Now, it was either men or women in religious houses, right? You would never mix the two because they weren't mixed. So Mother Superior would go and wash the feet of 12 of her sisters. The abbot would go and wash the feet of 12. And this went on for centuries and centuries. Pius XII introduced that to the Mass of Holy Thursday. And at the time, he said it was viri, which is men in Latin. And that was the tradition until 3 years ago, and this Pope changed it and said, you know what, it's not so much the washing of the disciples' feet, the 12 men, the 12 apostles, it's really about discipleship. It's washing the feet of those that will go out and service people, and help. So he changed that. So anyway, the question was to me, when did that come into Mass? Well, it was never, we've been doing that for centuries and centuries, but it was always done in the context of the office in religious houses. But it was Pius XII that allowed that as an option to be brought into the Mass of Holy Thursday. Anyway, little side note there, a little bit of history. So, Second Vatican Council comes along. So they issued the great document on the liturgy, Sacrosanctum Concilium, on the 4th of December 1964. Now, what is Sacrosanctum Concilium? It is a blueprint of what the Church Fathers wanted to see over the next few years. How many years? Well, the reforms of the Council of Trent took 50 years to implement. And the reforms of the Council of Trent meant a new missal, a new breviary, setting up of the seminary system, a catechism, a sort of attempt at the Code of Canon Law. Big things, right? Took 50 years. This is in the middle of the 16th century. No computers, no telephones, no texting, no instant messaging, all this sort of stuff, right? It took 50 years to do that. What do you think it would take Vatican II? Well, it's still going on. It's not done. It's not finished yet. The last document that came about the proper implementation was 2001. And I'm not convinced that there's not another one coming in the future. So bear in mind, Sacrosanctum Concilium was a blueprint of what the Church Fathers wanted to see happen. They didn't have a time scale on it, right? They didn't know how long this was going to take. So when the fact that Sacrosanctum Concilium says, yes, we'd like to allow some vernacular in the Mass, that's all it says. However, we want to retain the use of Latin. How's that going to work out? When you say two broad principles like that, how do we work out? What's the percentage? How much Latin do you want? How much English do you want? Well, they'd say, I don't know. You ask Paul VI this, I don't know. We've got to work this one out. But what happened was people grabbed the document and said, we can have English in the liturgy. We're going to turn everything into English. It's wonderful. What about the Latin bit? Oh, we didn't read that bit. We'll forget that. Not going to keep that one. We didn't look at the things that we didn't like. We just looked at the things we liked. And we went off and started doing things. So then, on the 25th of January, look how far this is away from the 4th of December. 2 months. 2 months later, Paul VI has to issue a motu proprio, which is a document from his own authority, which says, basically this document says, whoa, 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 whoa. You're going off track here. That's not what we said, and that's not what we want. So stop it. Read that document. It will tell you that's what it was. Because people just got this document. They said, oh, great, we can have vernacular, we can do this, we can have community of those species, we can do this, and priests can get married. And no, it didn't say any of that sort of stuff. So Paul VI, 2 months later, has to issue this motu proprio. Anyway, this is all a different part of history. I could talk about this for a long time. But bear this in mind. Please never, ever, ever misquote Sacrosanctum Concilium by taking 2 or 3 words out of it and saying, this is what the church wanted. You can't do that. It was a blueprint. It was an idea. And how it was all going to work out is going to come over the next 50 years with massive decrees, documents, encyclicals, motu proprios, etc., coming out of the Vatican that would guide and form how liturgy is today in 2018. So just remember, those documents that come out of the council are blueprints, if you like. They're blue sky vision, if you like. They're all-encompassing direction, but they're not the nitty-gritty of how it's going to work out on the day, right? So then Paul has to set up, St. Paul sets up the Concilium ad exequendam, Constitutione de Sacra Liturgia, which we call the Concilium. This was the group of 3,500 consultors and a staff of 25 full-time priests and religious in Rome that was set up for the proper implementation of Sacrosanctum Concilium. So we refer to this as the Concilium. This was the controversial figure, Father Annibale Bonini, who was head of the Concilium. Archbishop Bonini, as he became later. He's a very un uomo discutibile, as the Italians say, a discussable person, which means, Anyway, he was in charge of this, and so if you're interested in that sort of whole thing, it's a beautiful thing about Bonini and his involvement in this. The first instruction of 5 then was issued in 1964 in September. January, Paul issues this thing saying, hey, calm down, that's not what we meant. And in 64, he starts the first of these instructions on how Sacrosanctum is to be implemented. And that is late 64. Then in 67, they issue another one, which established further adaptations of the order of Mass. And then the next one in 1970, which regarding the central role of the bishop in the renewal of the liturgy in his diocese. Basically, this document said, bishops, you're in charge in your diocese. Make sure this is happening. Make sure the reform is happening, but also make sure abuses are not happening. That's that document. And then in 1994, there was this other document called Veritatis Legitimae, which means legitimate variations on the Roman Rite, which sort of basically says, there are certain things we can allow in acculturation and cultures coming into the Mass, but there's certain things we can't. So all these documents are clarifications, if you like, where people are going off the wrong track. The fifth and the last one was in 2001, which is that Liturgiam Authenticam, which is about the translations of Mass, which this Pope has changed a little bit right now. But anyway, so will there be another one in 2020? I don't know. It might be. But you can see that this was not, we issue Sacrosanctum Concilium, off, go on off, do what you want. There's all these things that are coming. And these are just the major things I've mentioned. There are decree after decree after decree coming out of the Congregation for Divine Worship every day. All right? It's a fascinating part of history. My academic studies were it was 18th century French liturgical development, the missals of Paris in the 18th century. Yeah. So I know if you want a copy of that, come and see me after. I'll let you have a copy. But that's my study, and it's it's like anybody's study. It's like mine, and no one else likes it, but I like it because it's mine. But my main interest in liturgical study is this period of 1963 to 1975. It's fascinating stuff. I could talk about that for a long time. But it's the most important time of liturgical development, I think, because, the great commentators like Louis Boyer would say to you, it was such a difference. The Missal of Paul VI is so different from the ones that came before. It was a massive change. It was a massive change. The liturgical development since the 4th century has not seen something so massive. That's how important this is, that period 63-75. Anyway, let's do those. Oh, here we go. So there's a beautiful quote. This is just something I had to put up for someone else. But basically, this idea of active participation. You talk to anybody about Sacrosanctum Concilium, and they hark on you. Active participation. It's all about active participation. Active participation. That's all it's about. It's people doing stuff. That's what we need. That's what No, it's not about that. Anyway, active participation is mentioned in Sacrosanctum Concilium 12 times. Sacrifice is mentioned 9 times. Meal is not mentioned at all. 44 times the Mass, 12 the Eucharist. Sacrosanctum Concilium is about the Mass, right? It's not about active participation, although that was the rallying call of a lot of people. And it still is to this day, that it's all about active participation. No, it was about the Mass, really. So anyway, what happened after the council was, here's a quote from Robert Taft. I'll read it, but you'll read it quicker than I will read it out. Robert Taft was a tremendous liturgist. He's a Jesuit. He died in November of last year. His speciality were the Eastern rites, and he was a professor in Rome at the Eastern Rite College there. And it's just famous. He's American. He was related to Taft, who I think was a president. Was Taft a president here? Yeah. He comes from that sort of family. But he's great. Died last year. A little acerbic in his comments, but that's why I like them, I think, because he could get away with them because he was highly intelligent and very well respected in the world of liturgy. After Vatican II, some people unfortunately thought that they had to be creative. As I've said more than once, I've never understood why people who have never manifested the slightest creativity in any other aspect of their human existence all of a sudden think they're Shakespeare or Mozart when it comes to the liturgy. That's sheer arrogance. Which is true. It's a beautiful quote. Suddenly we're all liturgists all of a sudden because, we've read a document and we've pulled out 2 words saying more active participation of the laity. Oh, great. I'll go and dance to the altar this week or, whatever. And it's true. I mean, we all thought, a lot of people thought that suddenly we're all Mozarts and, we can all write good music and we're all Shakespeare and we can all write our own prayers. This was another thing which was massive abuse. But in the vernacular, before the Missal was published in 1970, priests were taking it on themselves to translate the Latin into their own English. And guess what? Translating Latin into English is a tough job. And so you do it, you do it off the cuff, you're going to come up with all sorts of things that might not be theologically correct. So here's another quote by Taft. I just love Taft because he's so sort of frank and, whether you like him or not, this is a great quote. What you get out of liturgy is the privilege of glorifying Almighty God. If you think it's about you, stay at home. It's not about you. It is for you, but it's not about you. I wish more people could have the nerve to say that, that liturgy is the privilege, right? It's the privilege of worshipping Almighty God. It's not about you. Stay at home, he says. It's not about you. It's for you, but it's not about you. If we could just, get that tattooed on our arms and look at it every time before we go to Mass, this idea, it is a privilege to worship Almighty God. In the Psalms it tells us how blessed are they who understand what pleases God. We understand what pleases God. The worship of him, which is our duty and our salvation. But this idea that we go to Mass and we think it's all about us, it's what we like, it's what we can cope with. It's all about, no. Privilege of worship Almighty God. Great quote from Robert Taft there. Now, this idea of active participation. Here's what Paul VI said to the Concilium in October when they had a general meeting in Rome, in 66, sorry. He said, intense effort must be brought to bear on the agreement between the lex orandi with the lex credendi, so that in its meaning, prayer preserves the riches of dogma. Lex orandi means the law of prayer. Lex credendi means the law of believing. And basically this is a Latin idiom which means basically how you pray expresses what you believe. You pray your belief, basically, you could say that. The law of prayer, the law of belief. So what it's saying is how we pray and what we say and what we do and how we posture and all this is an expression of what we believe. It's a beautiful idiom. But what Paul VI is saying to the Concilium in 1966, we've got to make sure there is agreement between what we pray and what we believe. And therefore, prayer must preserve the riches of our dogma as Catholics. We have a very rich dogma. We're a dogmatic church. We're a hierarchical church. We've got to maintain that dogma. Otherwise, we become non-Catholic. I had a gentleman write to me a couple of months ago about complaining about the Archdiocesan Liturgical Handbook and said, it's just the rules, you people are in rules, and it's all rules with you, and there's, how's that going to, feed the poor, and, all this sort of thing, as though one excludes the other, It's like you can't do charitable works and have rules, right? I mean, that's ridiculous. But he said that, and I wrote back to her. I think I wrote a reasonable letter, and I said, no, it's not about that. It's about it. And he wrote back, and he said, well, we're just going to have to differ there. Because my idea of church is not a church that is dogmatic or hierarchical. It is one that goes out and services the poor. And I'm like, okay, well, you really have got the wrong church, because the reason why I'm Catholic is that it is dogmatic and it is hierarchical. That's why I'm Catholic. That's why I stayed Catholic. Otherwise, I'd be wandering the world right now looking for a church that pleases me. No. It's the beauty of the Catholic Church, isn't it? We've got 2,000 years of dogma, which means teaching, And that develops, of course. Things change. But the dogma more or less stays the same. It's the same sort of stuff St. Ambrose was saying in the 4th century as Pope Francis is saying now. That's why we're Catholic. Oh, and it's hierarchical as well. Guess what? Because I work for my bishop. And he can tell me to go and work in Portland if I annoy him, which he did. No, I mean, but now I'm working for Archbishop Sample. I mean, that's us priests. We're in this hierarchy, and the hierarchy. And people say, "Oh, I don't like hierarchy. It means the priests are better than that." It doesn't mean better, but there's a different hierarchy. And when we're in that hierarchy, look at that hierarchy and don't say there should be no hierarchy, because us priests can be sent tomorrow to go to a parish that no one wants to go to. And we have to say, yes, Bishop, I will go to that parish. I will take the parish that no one else wants. And he says, good lad, Gerard, I knew you'd do it. You're a good priest. I'm like, I'm an idiot for doing it again. But that's hierarchy for you. That's how we live. And if we didn't have that hierarchy, guess what? Some of the parishioners who are most disagreeable would never have a priest, because we would choose, because it's not a hierarchy. So I'm not going to do that. Oh, and I want 20 grand extra. And a Tesla. And then I'll do it. No, because we're in a hierarchy. Our salvation is linked to that hierarchy. My salvation is linked to my bishop, my ordinary, the Bishop of Fall River. He can say to me, now when you come back, you're going to go to this parish. Or you're going to be a hospital chaplain. Whatever. That's it. We live in a hierarchy. Dogmatic and hierarchical church, that's the difference between us and congregationalists who just say, okay, we are the church, and we will vote our priest in this week. Well, it's not sacramental, and you're not going to get any sacraments with that sort of stuff. But you know that. Liturgical principles. So I'm going to do a few liturgical principles, and then we're going to have a break for 10 minutes, and then we'll sort of come back and finish up some stuff. These straight for SC stands in the book for Sacrosanctum Concilium, the most important document that will be referred to in this book because it is the source of the reform as we started out. Listen to this. Regulation of the sacred liturgy depends solely on the authority of the Church, that is, the Apostolic See, as laws may determine on the bishop. So fundamentally, Rome is saying, Paul VI is saying, remember this, the Vatican, me, the Holy See, we regulate the liturgy, and we may give some things to the local bishops. That's the way it's going to work. In the virtue conceded by law, the regulations of liturgy within certain defined limits belongs also to various kinds of competent territorial bodies of bishops legitimately established, i.e. the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. So they can have some laws that they can come up with themselves if all the bishops in the country agree with them, right? And then it's no good them just doing it. Then they've got to go to send it back to Rome, and Rome has got to say, we give you the recognition, you can do this as a law in your own country. That is very rare. People misquote this a lot with music, saying, oh, well, the USCC bishops said this in their document, sing to the Lord, right? That's not a magisterial document. It's not binding on anybody. It never received recognition from anybody. It was like Archbishop Sample's letter. It's a teaching document, that's all. It doesn't contain any juridical law or anything for this territory. So, but people say, oh, the Vatican approved. No, it didn't approve that. But that's what this means, is the liturgy, sometimes the bishops are given permission to do things and they'll bind it for the whole country. 3, this is important. Therefore, no other person, even if he be a priest, may add, remove, or change anything in the liturgy of his own authority. This is not in 1972. This is the document from the council. They could see already the movement that if people don't understand that the liturgy is the most sacred possession that we have, they're going to start doing their own stuff. And this was a warning to them. No other person, even if he be a priest, can add, change, or remove anything from the liturgy. And unfortunately, from 1963 to 1975, I would say, that period, this happened all the time. So that would be a good place to start. Let me tell you, just give you an example, a sort of like very practical example of the difference between Sacrosanctum Concilium and what we have now in how we do things. So one of the big things at the Second Vatican Council in the thing was the Church Fathers said in Sacrosanctum Concilium we should allow a more generous application of concelebration. Before the Second Vatican Council, concelebration was not allowed in the Roman Rite. It was allowed, as in the priest on his first Mass, at his ordination Mass, could concelebrate with the bishop. Apart from that, we didn't concelebrate. So now, I have various thoughts on concelebration, but how does it work out? So concelebration, you get the idea where, like the three of us this morning, we concelebrated. I was the principal concelebrant, Father Bill, Father Argy were the concelebrants. So 3 priests at one altar celebrating one sacrifice of the Mass, but also 3 sacrifices because we all have our own intentions, and that's a little more complicated, but basically we all 3 of us celebrate Mass. But as far as you're concerned, there's just one Mass going on. But really, there's 3 sacrifices being offered. It's more complicated than that. Let me not get into that. Anyway, it's simplistic to say it's not 3 sacrifices, maybe 1 sacrifice. But anyway, so look at me in 2019. I'm having difficulty explaining it to you. So in 1964, Second Vatican said, we want more generous application of concelebration. Okay, when? Well, when priests are gathered in a meeting, something like priest gatherings throughout the world, that's a good time they can celebrate. What about Sunday Mass? Well, no, there's no need to do that. We don't need that. What about in monasteries and convents? When priests are in a conventual living, like 500 Franciscans live together. Yeah, that would be a good idea. So instead of each priest getting up in the morning celebrating a private Mass that goes on for like 2 or 3 hours from 6 till 9, if you've got hundreds of priests in there, let them all concelebrate together. Good idea. Great. How's that going to happen? I don't know. What did we do before? Well, we didn't do it before. Oh, okay. Who does it? The Eastern Orthodox, they do it. What do they do? Oh, well, let's not get into that because that's really, that's crazy stuff because that lasts for 3 hours and they chant everything in Greek. Okay, let's not do that. Well, what should we do? Well, okay, I've got an idea. Well, they just all vest in the same, they all get the vestments on, they go and stand on the altar. Great. Where do they stand? I don't know. Behind the other priest? Okay. Should they be able to touch the altar? These are questions that were asked by the concilium. Should they be able to touch the altar? Why would they want to touch the altar? I don't know. How far away should they be from the altar? Well, they should be close to the altar. How many concelebrants can you have? Paul VI said 25. Why did he get 25 from? He just thought it was a good idea. 25. That's the maximum you can have. Why? Suddenly you can't concelebrate after 20. What if there's 26? What if there's someone you didn't count and you found out afterwards there's 26? Was that invalid? No. So honestly, 25 was the thing that Paul VI said. So it's like, well, how do you do this? So should the priest, so there were certain rules, right? So how are we going to do this? Okay, Paul VI says, what we'll do is we'll send out to the big Benedictine houses of liturgical scholarship, Salem, Maria Lac, one in America, I can't remember which one, St. John's, I think, Collegeville. And they said, okay, you guys start experimenting with concelebration. We want photographs, and we want written reports about every time it's done and what were the pros and cons and things like this. Send it all back to the concilium in Rome, and then we will write a rite of concelebration. And that's what happened. We just experimented. In fact, in Rome and San Anselmo, where I studied, I've seen the photographs that they sent to Rome about in their church, in their abbey church there, about concelebrations. So we didn't know what we're doing. So let's face this. This is Sacrosanctum Concilium in 1963, and the questions about these things, this is just one of the issues, right? I can go on forever about other things. But how do you concelebrate? Well, where are the priests got to be? There's the other thing. They should be in sight of the altar so they can see the altar. You know, could they be in another building? No, that wouldn't be right. So there are certain sort of rules of this. But at the time, it was like, where do we go? Do we stand? Here's the other thing the Benedictines do, which I think is a really nice thing for concelebration. I was in Spain recently, and we were at a Benedictine monastery, and they have this massive church, and it's sort of like this. So say there's a square altar in the middle of this sort of church here. And what the Benedictines do at their concelebration, the monks, there's probably 20 monks, they go around all the altar, and all the priests stand in a square around the altar. It's very, very moving. And this church, I'll tell you this as well, which is strange, but it sort of got me. This is massive. It's an underground church, and the square altar. So we're all up there, and my Spanish is no good, but they asked me to do something, and I don't remember what I didn't understand fully what it was they wanted me to do. So I was a bit nervous anyway. So, a priest comes up to me and says, oh, sure, yeah, va bene. I was speaking Italian. I don't know what he's doing. And I found out later that I had to take communion to the sick monks that stayed in the convent. Anyway, so it's beautiful, and I think they actually, the words of consecration are in Latin. So the abbot prior is in the front here in this square. We're all around this. It's beautiful there, and it's sort of dark in this church. And at the consecration, when he lifted the host, all the lights in the church went out, and all you could see on the altar were the candles of the altar. That's in some way you could just see the main priest elevating the host. It was frightening and spectacular at the same time. It was really, I'd never seen that in my life, that the lights in this whole church, and obviously the parishioners who were there are used to it. So, but me and my colleague who were traveling there, we like, I was nervous anyway because I had this thing that in my mind I had to do something, and suddenly, smack, and you could hear the switches in the electrical panel go, and it sort of clacked, and all the lights went out. And just from candlelight on the altar, you see the abbot raising the elevated host. It was absolutely tremendous. It was, really. Anyway, that's a concelebration. So we had this period. So like in 1972, they issued the rite of concelebration. Oh, no, it was earlier than that. I think it was 1971. To tell us how we're going to concelebrate. But can you see this idea that the Second Vatican Council had these ideas at the council, but they didn't know how they were going to work out yet. And that's what the Concilium did between 1964 and 1973. And that's that whole period of the Catholic Church's reform of the liturgy, which people don't, bother with or don't understand. They just think it just sort of like plopped on someone's desk in 1975. It didn't. We didn't know some of these things. So it's fascinating in history of how we did these things and celebrate. Just celebrating the vernacular. What are we going to change in the vernacular? All these different things. It's quite an interesting period of life. But I just want to give you that impression that, it just didn't fall out of heaven in 1970 when the new missile was published. They had to go through all these questions about how do we do this? Are we going to turn around now? Do we greet the people? Do we do, all these sort of things? Fascinating history. Anyway, let's have a 10-minute break, can we? And let's be back at 11:20, and then we'll crack on with that. Just quick 10 minutes, have a cup of coffee or a bun or a cake or something.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mysteries of the Mass podcast. This episode, which is part 1 of 2, is something you can subscribe to if you just go to my website, fatherbill.org, FRBILL.org, or you can go directly to mysteriesofthemass.com, or go to iTunes and subscribe there. If you wish to download the ALH, you can just go to archdpdx.org/divine-worship. God bless you.